The third session of the Desmond Greaves Summer School, Weekend Summer School, is the 27th such occasion, as many of you know, and one of the purposes of the school is to examine issues before the country and to try and propose alternatives to the usual political or intellectual orthodoxy. And we hope the programme this weekend does that to some extent. And this afternoon we have a very important topic, of course, which is continually with us, about the media, in particular the media in the context of the economic crisis. Housekeeping item, I'll pass around again the attendance sheet, but there's no point anyone signing it if you've already given your name and address for future communication. So the chairman of our session this afternoon is Dr. Mary Murphy, who's lecturer in Irish Politics and Society in Maynooth, the National University of Ireland at Maynooth. And Mary has a long interest in social affairs. She's campaigned on many good causes. She's written widely on social policy and related issues, and not least, and she's particularly interested in media issues.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks. Is that okay? Talking in enough, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have an interest in media issues. I suppose I don't write centrally on the media issues. I find myself more often, sometimes, as a media actor commenting on things, and my interest in the media is often looking at the media from a gendered perspective, so I'd be interested in maybe digging into that theme a little bit later on. But the main meat of the event, if you like, is the two gentlemen on my left and right who self-described have called themselves the left-wing tag team of the banking inquiry. So you might have known, some of you might have seen them in action in terms of giving evidence to the banking inquiry in relation to the media aspects. So we're very lucky that we'll be able to maybe develop that analysis here today, as they'll develop some of what they said there, but also wider issues. So starting with Harry Brown, who is a lecturer in the School of Media in Dublin Institute of Technology, and who has written widely and two books that you might be aware of. I've got on my glasses to get the titles exactly right. His most recent one being Frontman and Bono in the Name of Power, which has been widely reviewed and I think quite well received. And the other outside Ireland, and then Hammered by the Irish. And he's presently working on a new series of pamphlets that are coming out from Cork University Press. So to look out for them, a series of critical pamphlets in relation to looking at the public sphere and the role of the media in Ireland, and he'll be contributing to that. Julian Marcel is from the School of Geography in UCD, and again he's been quite prominent in the media with comment on how the media have been engaging in the crisis, and from a very critical perspective looking at the embedding nature of the role of the media in deepening neoliberalism in the context of the crisis. So he has two recent books to that extent, one from Routledge looking more particularly at the media, but his most recent one from Routledge Press, Deepening Neoliberalism, Austerity and the Crisis, Europe's Treasure Island. Ireland. I see why they wouldn't put it as the name, but
It'll work.
No, it works. So we're going to just give both speakers 25 minutes, a half an hour each, and then open the floor to questions. So I hope we have a lively afternoon. I suspect we might. And I'm going to start off with Harry Brown.
It's great to be here again after many years and see many familiar faces. Particularly nice to be here on a somewhat auspicious day for the left in these islands, you'd have to say. We're hoping for the best. I certainly can remember days when Jeremy Corbyn was a friend to many of us in this room when we were looking for friends. And so we, as I say, hope for the best. It's also great to be at an event on this topic, at an event honouring Desmond Greaves. Greaves, like many of the great sort of activists and political actors of the 20th century, was an editor of a publication. He was active in the media. He was sort of de rigueur in the 20th century. If you had a movement, if you had something you were trying to get done, you had a publication to go with it. So the Connolly Association had the Irish Democrat, and Greaves edited that. We know, of course, James Connolly and Jim Larkin were also editors. So I like to kind of claim these people for the flag of journalism, although it was just one of the many flags that they lined up with and behind. So without further ado, as Mary suggested, I'm going to be sort of bringing some of the same, sort of a slightly longer version of some of these ideas that I shared in my opening statement to the banking inquiry at the end of March. Julian got to go first on that occasion, so I insist on going first today. I think you'll see that we share a largely similar analysis, but hopefully we'll have some challenges and some opportunities to think harder about that analysis today. We're talking about the media and the crisis, and print and broadcast media in Ireland, I argue, played an immeasurable but almost certainly significant role in the inflation of the property bubble and the legitimation of risky behavior by the financial services sector in the lead up to the crisis of 2007 and 8. And it did so partly by ignoring or marginalizing skepticism about those phenomena, the phenomena of the bubble, the phenomenon of risky behavior. I'm going to focus here on the newspaper industry. It's what I know best. It's what I've done most of my research on. And I will argue that the socially destructive role that newspapers played in the crisis, and indeed since, should be understood not as a failing of Irish newspapers, but as one of their features. A feature that flows predictably from commercial media's structural relationship with the corporate forces that benefited from the bubble. While this relationship is of very long standing and it continues to some extent to this day, certainly the property supplements have been growing again over the last 12 months, I will argue that there were certain aspects of the development of newspapers, not only in Ireland but elsewhere in the 1990s and early 2000s, particularly acute in Ireland, that made newspapers especially vulnerable to domination by those forces and weakened the capacity of journalists to play the critical, adversarial, investigative role as seen on television that journalists, no doubt, most of them deep in their heart of hearts, do value. Within journalism and in research about journalists and journalism, and I guess I'm on kind of both sides of that particular phrase. I continue to be a practitioner and see myself as a practitioner, but also a researcher about journalism. That sort of value, that value of critical, adversarial, investigative, is part of the set of features that often go into the rubric of journalistic professionalism. That term encompasses a whole set of principles and performances, and I won't get too postmodern about this, but I would suggest that in many respects professionalism is a performance of a set of values, a set of principles and performances that supposedly drive journalists to seek the truth impartially and to question the powerful doggedly. Although Irish journalists, in my experience, have a healthy hesitancy to shout too loudly about those sort of principles and to perform too conspicuously in relation to them, compared to, for instance, American journalists who are constantly banging on about their First Amendment rights and responsibilities. I do believe that most of us do espouse those principles honestly. They're captured in such largely symbolic documents as the Code of Conduct of the National Union of Journalists, a very fine document, the Code of Practice of the Press Council of Ireland, another fine document. Good documents, not necessarily terribly well reflected in practice. I don't want to romanticize the journalism of an earlier age. Nostalgia is always a risk, particularly in gatherings like this, where the ratio of bald heads and gray hairs is very high. But it is the journalism of my day and of our day had plenty of its own problems, many of them involving the limits and shortcomings of professionalism. But it is the case, I think, and this is largely borne out in research and in some really exceptional historiography about journalism, that over the last 30 years or so, the principles that are embedded in that word professionalism are widely understood to be increasingly at risk, if not vanishing, all over the world, with particular features of the media landscape responsible for endangering them. One leading scholar of American journalism, Daniel Hallen, has written, "For the most part, I don't think journalistic professionalism is breaking down from the inside by journalists becoming less committed to it. Instead, I think professionalism is being squeezed into increasingly smaller niches within the media field." It's an interesting idea. Then it's not that journalists are less concerned about doing the right thing. It's just there's just less and less room for them to do that. It's my contention, and this is sort of the guts of my own research, it's my contention that in Irish newspapers we can almost literally see that squeeze occur in the space of the newspaper itself over the period between about 1990 and 2007 as the physical construction of newspapers changed and changed quite dramatically. There was, in effect, an inscription of an unquestioning pro-business ideology and practice onto increasingly large, advertising-heavy proportions of the newspaper. Now, advertising had, for many centuries, been a very important component of how newspapers functioned. But what you got in the late 20th century was an ever-growing devotion of certain sections of the paper, business and finance, property, lifestyle sections, dedicated to the advertising of, respectively, recruitment, real estate, and consumer goods and services. Even the most scrupulous of newspaper editors came to see these sections as the home for, at best, what you might call professionalism light, where soft treatment of the rich and powerful was to be expected. Although I was struck when the newspaper editors got up at the banking inquiry the day after Julian and I were on, they insisted that the property supplements were no such thing and that they were the home of the most responsible, dedicated professional journalism you can imagine. Incredible, really. So even as a journalist, even if you worked in the niches of a newspaper where full-blown professionalism still held sway, at least on the face of it, that is to say, if you were working in domestic news pages or on the foreign desk or providing political coverage, for example, it was hard to miss that there was a message increasingly daily embedded in a big, colorful product that landed at your doorstep or on your desk every morning about your employer's relationship to financial institutions, property interests, and other corporate bodies. The newspaper itself became one giant embedded product. Those supplements were, after all, paying the bills, and we were reminded of that on a regular basis. You couldn't get into the lift in the Irish Times without being told by some property executive how much money they were making, or maybe how much money they had turned away that day. There was so much demand for advertising, and there wasn't enough space in the paper to take all the ads that they wanted to put in, just because we wanted to put news in it. When the Irish Times infamously paid over €30 million for myhome.ie in 2006, that just appeared to confirm the paper's dedication to what increasingly looked like its actual core business, advertising property sales. I saw no less than Fintan O'Toole admit a few months ago that he was, that at some level, he had to be delighted that there's another property bubble happening in Ireland because it's pulled the Irish Times out of the small way out of a very, very deep financial crisis again. This obviously has consequences for the newspaper's capacity to deal impartially with subjects such as, for instance, the desirability of property ownership itself over other forms of tenure for housing, or the related question of will there be a soft landing in the property market? A group of Irish financial journalists who spoke on condition of anonymity to a team of academic researchers who published their findings in 2010, they were talking just at the time that the crisis had broken, talked about this issue. One of them said, "Much of the mainstream media seems to me to be very conflicted because of their reliance on real estate and recruitment advertising." And recruitment is an important part of the picture as well, the business supplements, which are essentially a few puffy business stories wrapped around a lot of advertising for jobs, particularly during the boom. That doesn't mean reporters consciously avoid writing bad news stories. This is still a quote from a journalist, but it's hard to run against the tide when everyone is getting rich. Now, I'll talk about whether journalists were getting rich in a few minutes. That is an interesting part of the equation. Another journalist said journalists were leaned on by their organizations not to talk down the banks in the property market because the organizations have a heavy reliance on property advertising. In 2006, I myself interviewed dozens of journalists about the direction that the Irish Times was then going in. I had left the paper 3 or 4 years earlier. One of them, Seamus Martin, who had also retired in 2002, said to me, he recalled, "In the mid-1980s, we had a series investigating the truth behind buying and selling property." Can you imagine that now? And even in the 1980s, he said, the commercial side of the paper, that is to say the people who sold advertising as opposed to the journalists, were in complaining like nobody's business. But the editor at that time in the 80s, Douglas Gageby, stood up to them, Seamus told me. But the idea that certain much smaller than parts of the newspaper were professionally compromised territory was already in the air as early as the 1980s. A former business editor from independent newspapers in another piece of research recalled a lunch from the 1980s when journalists and brokers gathered to mark the appointment of a new president of the Irish Stock Exchange. The idea even that journalists would be invited along to a lunch where brokers would celebrate the new president of the stock exchange is revealing in itself. This is in the 80s, in those bad old days. The lunch went well, this journalist recalled. The lunch went well and all the proprieties were observed until, during the port, the topic of mutual dependence between the press and the business community came up in the conversation. What do you mean, mutual? A rubicund and slightly tipsy broker ventured. The business pages are ours. We own them. Trudging back to the office, this is still this journalist speaking, I admit an icy feeling was coursing through my veins. Maybe the chap with the English public school accent was right. He was implying that we were lazy. We journalists were lazy, dependent, and largely uncritical. More chillingly still, maybe our employers, who shared the same gentlemen's clubs with the brokers, were happy with such an arrangement. But troublesome though that may have been at the time, those business pages were relatively small turf within the territory of a newspaper in the 1980s. By the time of the Celtic Tiger, this compromised, at best, turf of business and financial journalism had expanded many times over, both in the volume of pages produced and in the number of journalists employed. In that research that I cited earlier, the authors summarized the view of several of the Irish financial journalists they interviewed. This again is a quote. According to journalist F, because of the need for regular contact with financial sources, some journalists are reluctant to be critical of companies because they fear they will not get information or access in the future. Journalist E believes some journalists were far too close to their sources. Now this happens in other realms as well, of course. If you're, there's one or two security correspondents out there, for example, maybe you're a little too close to the Gardaí, but this happens certainly in business. They viewed their sources as friends and allies and essentially became advocates to them. Their approach was justified editorially because many developers and bankers limited access to such an extent that it became seen to be better to write soft stories about them than to lose access. And in this research, a gentleman named Sean Fitzpatrick was cited as the prime example of that kind of banker. Extremely soft stories would be run to gain access. Journalist B said that daily financial journalism was almost entirely press release and stock exchange disclosure based. And journalist F noted, it was well known that some PR companies tried to bully journalists by cutting off access or excluding journalists from briefings. That is to say, if your story goes wrong, you don't get allowed in to get the next story. We see this happen when Alex Ferguson used to kick journalists out of the post-match press conferences. Many of the Irish journalists interviewed for that research said business media had become more adversarial since the crash of 2008. That is, I think, a dubious proposition, and certainly in research that's been done in Britain in the aftermath of the financial crisis there, a study found that there was no consensus even about the idea that financial and business journalists had any watchdog role at all in relation to markets and corporate behavior. Many financial journalists in that British research essentially had imbibed the view from much of the business literature that says journalism's job is simply as part of the market to exchange of information, hopefully accurate information that sort of greases the machinery of capitalism. That's the only role that journalists play, not as a watchdog, not as a scrutineer, simply as the place where information is traded. It's essentially the role that newspapers played back to the 17th century when they were founded as part of the mercantile explosion in Europe from the 1610s and 20s onwards. So that sort of ambivalence, to put it kindly, about being able to tell good, tough stories while maintaining source relationships isn't, as I said, isn't unique to financial and property journalism. But as the role and prominence of, particularly of financial and property sections, increased exponentially in the 1990s and early 2000s, their particular compromises, those special relationships, played a proportionately much bigger role in newspaper coverage of these important areas of the economy and of society. Their growth wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't unique to Ireland. It was part of a deliberate international development in the newspaper industry that sought to diversify newspapers' content and appearance to make them more attractive to advertisers, and to a lesser extent more attractive to readers, bigger, more colorful, looking like a better and more value for money package. So in the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this came to be called, in the marketing jargon of the day, this came to be known as total newspapering. And that essentially meant a de-emphasis on news. And this, the total part is an effort to break down traditional barriers between editorial and commercial considerations. That was often talked about as the wall between the commercial side and the editorial side. And you find in the memoirs of many journalists, leading editors of that period, a sense that that's desirable, that idea that there shouldn't be some separation between those who gather the news and those who are in the business of selling advertising. I think even Conor Brady's memoir, the editor of the Irish Times in the 90s and 2000s, pays some respect to this idea that's important that the editor is involved in all aspects of the paper, including the selling of advertising, without any real concern about whether there's a possible conflict of interest there. This was also known as market-led journalism, and it was a worry among many journalists. For instance, in 1997, a piece of research in Britain discovered that among journalists there are fears that the delicate balance between the self-interest of capitalist media owners and the public interest motives of journalists, that professionalism, public interest motives, has been upset. Some journalists have come to believe that the news is being stolen from them. And that's 18 years ago that research was published, and I think that remains very much the case. Maybe it's gone now. This market orientation doesn't express itself merely in the growth of financial and property journalism, but in the explosion of entertainment, lifestyle, and consumer-oriented sections and stories. As one scholar summarized it, when market orientation is high, journalists give emphasis to what the audience wants to know at the expense of what they should know. Audiences are not addressed in their role as citizens, concerned with social and political issues, but in their role as clients and consumers. Pick up your Irish Times today and you'll probably see that it's about 75% client and consumer to 25% citizen. A journalistic orientation to the logic of the marketplace crystallizes in a journalistic culture that provides help, advice, guidance, and information about the management of self and everyday life. The materialization of infotainment, news, and lifestyle journalism exemplifies this trend toward a blending of information with advice and guidance, as well as with entertainment and relaxation. And these developments in newspapers, of course, this hardly needs to be said to this audience, but they didn't happen by accident or in isolation. They were a vital cultural component of the larger global development of politics and economics over the last 3 or 4 decades that we've come to call neoliberalism. Some of us have anyway. As David Harvey writes, neoliberalization required both politically and economically the construction of a neoliberal market-based populist culture of differentiated consumerism and individual libertarianism. I think that's a really good description of the newspapers of the last 20 years. It's important to say, and I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about salaries, that we shouldn't blame most journalists individually or collectively for this situation, and they haven't been its obvious beneficiaries. Even in Ireland, where the booming economy did help newspaper circulation and profitability to remain healthy, even past the year 2000, there's been a journalistic culture of increased workloads, casualization, redundancies. I was one of those who took redundancy from the Irish Times 13 years ago. Rapidly changing technological expectations, declining real rates of pay. This is all happening throughout the industry, even before the wider bust of 2007, 2008. When my students graduate and go out to write features for the Irish Times, they will make less than I made in 1990, 91, even without adjusting for inflation. Less in actual, real cash money. When I interviewed newspaper journalists in 2006, so while the boom was still on, many of them were talking to me about about what had been lost. Their capacity to engage in critical scrutiny of government and business was overwhelmed by the day-to-day pressures of filling ever more space, print, online, online. Increasingly, the old newsroom where reporters worked within fields of specialization and could work for days or even weeks on stories before publishing anything had already 9 years ago had already changed beyond recognition. The job of careful consideration and analysis of events was largely left to a small coterie of editors and senior political writers who generally rose to those posts through a combination of caution and conservatism. As research elsewhere has also suggested, that is research outside Ireland, journalists who continue to feel that they should, and that's most journalists, they should be doing hard-hitting critical scrutiny of powerful institutions, felt disempowered from doing that. It's not surprising that in 2011, when a group of international scholars did a transnational scorecard of journalism's coverage of the financial crisis, they found that in Ireland, most of the stories were short on analysis, were episodic, shallow. And these conditions have, if anything, deteriorated further in the intervening years of collapsing circulation and desperate digitization. As one leading scholar has put it, the prevalent online media practice of recent years encourages journalists to rely more and more on a restricted pool of tried and tested news sources as a way of generating increased output. In general, it gives rise to a more office-bound, routine, scissors and paste form of journalism, as Nick Davies and others have called it. Such conditions also provide the context for the increasing power of the public relations PR industry. As noted above, the capacity of PR officers to give and withhold the information that hard-pressed journalists require to do their work gives them an influence over content to the benefit of their corporate and indeed state and government clients. An even more insidious form of PR influence comes in the form of flack. That's the negative attention and pressure that comes upon journalists when they attempt to report on sensitive stories. In theory, flack can come from any side of a story. In practice, most of it comes from the sides that can afford to generate it, at a volume and with a social standing that catches the ear of editors. For most journalists with a busy job to do, that's the sort of thing that becomes a good reason to ignore a story, or at least to avoid its more controversial elements. Ask any journalist who has worked on the Corb story in Mayo, for example, and you'll find out why it is that it's very difficult to do critical stories there. When you do, your editor hears about it from Shell's people, charmingly sometimes, aggressively sometimes. You'll inevitably be called in to answer for every line in your copy. It'll waste time that you could be spending doing another story that you need to be doing to generate money because you're a freelance, and it just becomes a very good reason to ignore the story. I had the experience myself. I was interviewed by a very good guy here who does some work for the BBC World Service, Dermot Fleming, for an item about U2's tax affairs, because I'd done this book about Bono. And Claire Daly has actually talked about this in The Doll, so it's completely sort of on the record. But Dermot interviewed her, me, a few other people, got a mildly critical piece about how Dublin views U2 and their tax concerns. And of course they got onto U2 for comment, and that was the trigger for unleashing flack. And a PR office in London got on the job of putting pressure on the BBC to ensure that this item never went out. And they blackened my name, and they made the journalist go back and get more sources, get more positive sources. Eventually, the clip they used from me was one in which I was complimenting Bono. So there was just, it took 6 months from the time that Dermot first recorded that item to the time it actually went out on a BBC World Service business program. And he probably spent a good 2 or 3 weeks out of that period working on it again, reworking it, and as I said, he's a freelance. He can't afford to be doing that. They paid him a bit extra for the trouble that he went through, but not enough to justify it. And anybody who might be thinking about doing a story on U2's tax affairs will think again when they hear that something like that's happening. So flack is really important. I always, over the years, flack is one of the, in the famous Noam Chomsky, Ed Herman 5 filters propaganda model, flack is one of the ones that's mentioned, but it's usually one of the ones that doesn't get talked about very much. It's actually very, very important in the work of journalism. Great. So is this, does this represent a conflict of interest for media? Sorry, just let me try that again. I missed a paragraph there. So what, I guess this is the sort of what can we do about it? And is this a problem that is limited to commercial media? I would argue that there's not. One of the media that I've been talking about quite a lot here is the Irish Times, and the Irish Times is owned by a trust, but is not immune to commercial pressures. RTE is owned by you and me. Certainly, its role in broadcasting property porn, for example, during the Celtic Tiger years bears a lot of scrutiny. Although RTE, I think it's not a coincidence that RTE, relatively less encumbered by some of the pressures that the newspaper industry faced, did probably break the largest number of critical stories about the banking industry, and about the property bubble itself, the famous primetime report on the property bubble, the National Irish Bank Isle of Man accounts in the late 90s, etc. Although newspapers did play their part, it's certainly not the case that newspapers never do critical stories. It is actually part of the interest of newspapers to do that. But is there a conflict of interest? Now, based on a lot of what I've said here, you could conclude that there isn't a conflict of interest at all, but a congruence of of interest between media organizations and developers and financiers who are cashing in on the bubble. That would be somewhat simplistic because journalists and newspapers and radio stations and websites do also have an interest in producing stories that challenge conventional thinking, afflict the powerful, and attract audiences. Nothing of what I've said here should be interpreted to mean that they don't sometimes do precisely that. The purpose of my analysis is not to bring moral condemnation down upon my colleagues in the press, but to understand why, in the specific context of the Celtic Tiger, beyond that context since then, the congruence of interests, the stuff that makes journalists line up behind the property developers and tell us that the only way to live is to own your home, and that the market is sure to have a soft landing. The congruence of interest might have been stronger and more influential than any potential conflict. While much of the professional practice of journalism is genuinely conducted with an acute awareness of professionalism that says this is how it should be done, nonetheless there are a whole host of other influences that determine the shape and content of a journalistic product, leading to biases in favor of talking up the economy, talking up the market, talking up home ownership, talking up property investment. How this happens is complex, it's contingent, and it's located where newspapers and their online forums find themselves, at the intersection of daily events, longer-term history, commerce, design, technology, routine, process, pressure, and not least economic and political power. That's an intersection that's traversed by the workers in the newspaper every day. Thanks.
So I'll talk a bit about the media, of course, and like Harry said, we had the same kind of double act at the banking inquiry, and I'll say that what I said there, but more stuff to try to explain some maybe current affairs or coverage we've seen in more recent days, like for the water charge protesters, for example, and all that, Podemos and Syriza. So the first thing to do for my presentation is just to, well, tell you how I understand the media, and we can talk about it later if you disagree or agree. The media, the way I'm talking about the mainstream media, of course, I see it as essentially corporate entities, right? And that influences the content they give us and the way they report on things. So they'll give us a corporate or business viewpoint, right? I don't know, sometimes it's a bit hard to understand. Some people don't believe that. It's interesting because if you look at, let's say, a trade union paper, nobody has any problem understanding that this reflects a trade union viewpoint. Why? Because they own the paper, they write the paper, they manage the paper, right? So it's easy. A student paper, same thing. People don't have a problem to say, well, this is going to be the Trinity students' viewpoint because they own the thing. And when you say, well, Dennis O'Brien owns this newspaper, it'll reflect a corporate viewpoint, people say, oh no, that's a conspiracy theory, it's not true, you're just like, a crazy leftist or something. But that's what it is. It doesn't mean it's bad reporting, it doesn't mean it's wrong reporting, inaccurate, it just means it's a specific viewpoint. So you have a lot of very good reporting in the media, but it reflects a certain viewpoint, and meaning if it reflects the viewpoint and interests of economic elites, very often it won't address the concerns of ordinary people, and that's where my critique comes in, right? The other thing, well, for RT, right, they're not a corporate entity, they're commercials, they have commercial pressures which are similar to the other commercial media, but they are led by the government, people are appointed by the government, so they reflect the viewpoints of the political establishment, which are very similar to the viewpoints and interests of the economic establishment. That's why you don't have such a big difference between RT and other newspapers, which are purely commercial, right? If you had, in theory, a very, very democratic state where decisions involve a lot of people, then you could have a public broadcaster, which would be very different from a corporate media, because people would have a lot of interests in managing it, and people like, I don't know, Harry could be named as, RT director or something like that, a critical person or a trade union person. But in our country and in most countries, it's not like that. That's why you have a similar coverage from both entities. Another aspect is advertising. That's easy to explain usually in Ireland because of the housing bubble. People have seen the property supplements, understand kind of intuitively that if you have a lot of advertising money from the property sector, there's going to be pressures on the journalists or the editors to not necessarily cover outrageously pro-housing bubble stories, but at least maybe to close their eyes on some controversial stories, and that was very well illustrated in Ireland. But you have, in the US, a good example is, let's say, Boeing advertises weapons in the Washington Post. Washington Post would be expected to have a slightly pro-war view, or at least not a big anti-war clear viewpoint, right? Because they get a lot of money from Boeing and others. And that's, again, it's not something like, it's not a speculation. If you go to the websites of RTE or newspapers and you go to the Advertise With Us section, you can see how much money they put and resources they put into getting advertising money. So RTE website is a good website for that. They'll say, okay, you want to advertise, call us, and it's not like some kind of obscure link. It's well presented. There's people working there, and they have a list of shows on the radio, for example, looking for sponsors, right? So they'll say, okay, we have Drive Time, looking for a sponsor. Who wants to sponsor Drive Time? And then another show will say, oh, sponsored by AIB Bank. Well, on the economy, it's show on the economy sponsored by banks. So you can imagine that the AIB will pull off the funding pretty quickly if it's every story you have is like, oh, the bankers are robbing us and stuff like that, right? So it's very, very clear. Newspapers, for instance, they advertise very prominently to potential advertisers. Oh, our readers are from social class A, B, that's the affluent ones. They have money to buy your stuff. We don't sell to poor people because advertisers don't care. I mean, they don't have money to sell very much, So if you're Volkswagen or BMW, you want an affluent audience, and that's why, again, the paper will gear its reporting towards those people. Right? So again, it's not anything conspiratorial. It's very explicitly stated and kind of proudly so by the media. Another thing is the experts we hear about on the news or quoted in newspapers. They not always, but they tend to come from establishment circles. So again, for the housing bubble, we had like stockbrokers or bankers, people like that. In times of war, you always have some retired military general. That's more prominent in the US, and they're the experts, apparently, not the anti-war or not like PANA or anything like that. I see Roger in the back. So that's very important in shaping the coverage. Now, I already talked about flag and ideology. That's very true also. He explained it very well, so I won't go into that. One thing we hear often, and it's like the conventional view, is that what about readers? Like newspapers react to what their readers want to read, and if they print this or that, that's because they want to sell papers like that. So it's not true that the corporate structure of the media or advertisers influence content. It's really the readers. So, well, first of all, empirically that's just not true, unless you assume and you want to try to prove that everybody in Ireland wanted to be told, buy a house in 2006 and 2007. There's no crash. No, you won't be in trouble. Just go, keep buying, keep buying. That's completely against the interests of everybody, right? So you have to prove things like that to say the readers have an impact on the coverage. Now, readers do have an impact, but again, you have to see who they write for. So let's say I'm a banker and I see a lot of bad reporting, business reporting in a paper, or lies or whatever. I'll call the Irish Times or I'll make them know that, look, I want information that's good for my needs. I don't want some kind of crazy stories that don't inform me about economic conditions in Ireland, right? You want to have a quality press in that regard. So in that way, yeah, the readers influence the coverage, but it's not like ordinary people in Ireland who do influence that. Now people say, oh yeah, what about the sports section? People want to know about rugby and all that. Well, that's kind of true, but it's true only if people don't know about other important issues, about poverty and things like that. It's like saying, like, I want a Big Mac. Well, maybe you want a Big Mac because it's been advertised so much to you, and then, you want that because you've seen that and you haven't seen other things, right? So in that way, people do influence, but within the constraints within the limits of catering to an establishment sector, okay? Now, about the good reporting. Sometimes people say, okay, well, you're saying that in Ireland like, it's all like bad reporting and you can't trust anything. There is good reporting. I think like we don't have, for example, a center-left paper like The Guardian in London, right, which is a good example. We don't have that here. The alternative press here, which would be more critical, is very small and not very established in my view compared to the US, for example, where you have a lot of good reporting and good critical websites. Here it is much smaller. So there is a good reporting here and there. There is specific commentators or journalists that you can read, like Vincent Brown or...
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. You don't like him? Okay, we can debate him after. I knew if I named names it would start. Maybe David McWilliams or Fintan O'Toole. There is a few people. No, okay.
Going backwards.
Exactly. I'm digging deeper. So there is good people like that. There is also the social affairs section, for example, in the Irish Times is very good. There is the Sunday Business Post, which I always give as an example of very good reporting. It's a business paper. If you read it, in my view, the quality is higher than a lot of things we have. They're serious people. They cover certain aspects of the economy and of Irish life. They do it very well. And so a bit like the Financial Times in London, right? They have a perspective, of course, but that's just quality. They're not there to tell stories that don't make any sense, right? So we have that. Another thing about social media, people say, oh yeah, we have Facebook and Twitter, so in Ireland it's really big and elsewhere. For me, that's kind of a red flag. If you're at the point that your news source is Facebook and Twitter, that's symptomatic of the fact that there is no real alternative press. So it's okay in the sense that it's better than nothing, I suppose, but I want to see something a bit more established in the country. Okay. Okay, I'll just talk about, I've talked about that many times, I've written about it, maybe you've heard it before, about austerity to illustrate what I've said. I did a study in my book. I read all the opinion articles on austerity and the budget from 2008 to 13, right? So the austerity years. And just to see, are they biased or what did they say? And what I found is very clear. I think it's kind of clear to anybody who reads the newspapers here and there that it's very pro-austerity, right? Just to give you percentages, about 60% of all articles were in favor of austerity, fiscal consolidation. 10% were against only, and the rest were neutral. Okay, so that's pretty clear. And if you look at the authorship, so I took at all the articles, most of them are written by journalists, so you exclude them, and you look at the outside writers, people like a banker or somebody like that. So in those people, 57% of them were from the financial sector or mainstream economists. Okay. 20% were Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael politicians. And only 7% were from progressive organizations like Social Justice Ireland or something like that. And 3% were trade union reps, right? So you often hear from people like Mark Coleman on the radio that trade unions are dominating the airwaves or something. They're not, they're there, but it's very small, right? So you could see just from the background of those people why it influences the coverage we have. Okay, very biased in favor of a fiscal consolidation. Now, the thing that's also, just to show how strong it was, even the 10% of progressive viewpoints, anti-austerity, even them, most of the time, they were not like anti-austerity. They were just saying we'll have a fairer kind of austerity, right? So we'll cut the budget deficit, all right, but we'll do it, let's say, by raising taxes on the corporations or something like that. So it shows that it's fine, maybe it's better than like a full pro-austerity viewpoint, but still, it's still a mild form. Only 2% of the articles said we want stimulus spending, deficit spending, which would be the real alternative to austerity, right? So it's just to show how little it was. So the debate was really about how do we implement austerity, not about should we have austerity. That was just like out the window completely. Okay, now I have a few little stories that you've seen on the news, I'm sure, and we can discuss more after that. Just to illustrate that, again, what I said, like any concept or theory, it's really empirically you prove or disprove that. So the more stories you have that back up your viewpoint, the stronger it becomes. That I'll just give you a few, but then we can have more. You remember a few months ago when the 6 Irish students in Berkeley died because of the collapse of the balcony and the residence halls. Everybody remembers that because we've heard so much about them. Even yesterday, I think there was one of them, I think he came back or something like that. So we still have coverage of that. We have even a tabloid press, like detailed histories of their background and all of that. Okay, that's fine. It's one thing that's covered. But on the same day or a day after the balcony collapsed, there was a major study released in Cork at Cork University saying that austerity in Ireland had caused 500 additional suicides, right? I don't know who had heard about that now or on that day, but it's 500 versus 6. The coverage was just like completely unbalanced, right? I think there was one or two stories about the suicides 2 or 3 days after. And that was me, I wrote about it a week after or something like that, right? So why is that? Well, obviously one thing is if you talk about 500 suicides caused by austerity, that's a direct attack on the establishment because that was their policy. We have fiscal consolidation, it's going to be good for the country. If you say, well, it killed 500 people, doesn't make Enda Kenny look very good, right? So that's one thing. The most important thing, I think. Other people have talked about the fact that students were also kind of middle class, students from South Dublin or something like that, so it caters to their interests to read about that. I mean, I think the stronger one is the first one. It's really because it attacks austerity, and that's just, it looks very, very bad. In Greece, same thing, there were more suicides because of austerity. It's normal when people lose jobs and become more depressed or things like that. That's one good point. Again, about Syriza and Greece, well, it's still ongoing, of course. In the Irish press or even the European press, you have a lot of demonization of Syriza and Tsipras. Now less so because he's kind of accepted more of the establishment's, European establishment's principles and views and interests. Before that, you'd see things like I don't know, Syriza is a radical party or an extreme left party. Okay, fine, if you want to call it like that, that's okay. But then you have to call other parties extreme right. You have to call them radical conservative parties, the ones on the right. And if you want to call them both like that, at least you're consistent. You can debate that use of language, but at least you have the same standards for both of them, right? Another thing is that we hear sometimes about Germany versus periphery countries, Germany versus Greece. And that's one factor, but you never hear about, in my view, which is a more important divide in Europe, which is about European elites everywhere against ordinary Europeans everywhere. Right? That's another kind of axis that's never discussed really. Because if you do that, again, what you do is that you make people realize that, okay, there's a grounds for linking ordinary people from Greece to Dublin, like activist groups have done here. I mean, it's not like a utopian idea. It's difficult to do, but that's we face a lot of the same constraints, a lot of the same problems with austerity again, right? And that you don't see that very much because it'd be more of a class analysis, and again, it would put the spotlight on the establishment everywhere. And I liked also during Greece, I don't know if you remember when they were negotiating this summer, I think just based on casual observation, the main expert or analyst to understand what was going on in the Irish press was Enda Kenny. He was always the one quoted, Enda Kenny says this and that, Enda Kenny says this and that. Not even economists, just Enda Kenny was saying to us what he thought. So, again, is that going to give you either a progressive viewpoint or an establishment one? The latter one for sure. Again, about Podemos, I did a little study quickly to see how Podemos, the new progressive party in Spain, was represented in the Irish press. I thought it would be a bit of work. It was very, very quick because I don't really talk about it, so it took me like a half an hour or something like that. Just to give you, since the time of their formation, up until a few months ago when I did the study, only 20 pieces talked about Podemos in any substantive way. That means I removed the ones that mentioned Podemos in one word at the bottom, right? Just the ones that I had in their starting paragraphs, right? 20, and most of them were a bit maybe ambivalent. They wouldn't tell you what Podemos really is. It's like progressive movements, very important. Maybe they would state that as fact, but they wouldn't talk about the implications. Some people even said they were, I'll just quote a bit here, an example of populism and thuggery, and they would fail economically. They would undermine freedom and democracy in Spain. That's Dan O'Brien from The Independent, right? Another great analysis by Dan O'Brien. You see, Podemos is very threatening to European establishment. Whether they win or not is not so important because they show an alternative, just like Syriza was. And if I was Dennis O'Brien, for example, I would not want to talk about them because if you talk about them, a lot of people will get ideas. It's like when the Arab Spring happened, it happens in one country, people say, oh, like it's done there, Occupy Wall Street, oh, it's done there. That's how social change works. If you're isolated, you'll never get anywhere. And the last thing you want if you're in power is that people know that they're not alone, facing the same kind of consequences. And the last one is about the water charges, and Sinn Féin, I put Sinn Féin in there too. As you can see, the water charges is like the one thing that is really ongoing. Just yesterday, I think, there was another article about Paul Murphy and Joan Burton, and it's all the same story, right? A number of hours, Joan was trapped in her car, that's 2. Right? I don't know if there's other examples where you use a number for 2. She was trapped there. Everybody knows it's 2.5 hours now because we've heard it so much. And she was thrown missiles at her. I had first to check with a linguist, like say, okay, in English, a missile, does that mean like a weaponry thing or a small thing? She said, well, it can be used for a small thing, but you can see why they use that word and not small thing. Maybe it puts to people's heads some kind of military attack on Joan Burton, right? What's interesting there, one thing that's interesting is the civil disobedience that's been going on, right? I came here 8 years ago from the US, so I'm kind of used to civil disobedience. It's bigger there. And here I thought it was a bit mild. When I got here, maybe I wasn't talking to the right people or whatever. But now anyway, I've seen a very good example with the water meter, and it's very well organized for the most part, right? It's just, it's not like violent or anything like that. And there's, even from journalists who usually would be mildly critical or rather critical in the mainstream, they were really, really against and opposed to those civil disobedience movements of, let's say, blocking the water meters from being installed, because that's something that really threatens policies from the establishment. Right? So you see a lot of demonization of that. Sinn Féin, again, I mean, that's a thing for discussion, is involved in the right to water movement, so it's included in that. In the article I talked about yesterday about Joan Burton and Paul Murphy, they thought they were talking about the protester that would be charged in court after the election, and they said also there was one of them was a senior Sinn Féin member, and that's it. Just left it like that. So you wonder, okay, who is that? Is that like Jerry Adams or something? Is it like, does it mean I can't vote for Sinn Féin? I mean, it was a bit the idea, I suppose. And Sinn Féin is demonized for many things. If you look at, the Sunday Independent, one weekend, or probably many weekends, had like 8 op-eds. Sinn Féin are a bunch of rapists. Sinn Féin are so violent. Sinn Féin, because whatever you think about Sinn Féin, that's not the problem. The problem is that the reason they talk about them in those ways, you can disagree with, you can criticize Sinn Féin all you want, but the reason they're criticized is not because of any of those things. It's because they're a challenge to the establishment here, right? And again, it's not to say that they're pure and anything like that, but that's why you see, and they're high in the polls. They are really in a position to change things, and the establishment reacts in exactly the way you would expect them to react by trying to demonize them. Okay, that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Julian, and again, thanks as well for coming in so well in time. So we've lots of time for discussion, and it means I have time too to add a couple of impressions of my own maybe into the picture before I open up to the wider one. And I suppose what I really wanted to take up from both Harry and Julian's was that issue of framing. And if we think of the important role the media play in framing, or giving us ritualized ways of understanding the world, and presenting a reality that it either plays down or it sort of rules out other realities or other possible ways of understanding the world. So Harry gave a really excellent example of the media playing the role in framing the property crisis, so that cynicism about soft life, that was ruled out other takes on what might be happening in the property crisis or who might be benefiting from it. And he argues that that's actually a core feature of the media. And just as Julian argued, that it's not really a conspiracy theory, because it's quite explicit, that core feature of the media, that their role is to frame. But the importance in framing should never be underestimated. And I suppose it's what Stephen Nukes talks of as that third face of power. Not specifically the power to make decisions or even to maybe set the agenda about which decisions might be made, but a really deep, and the most strongest form of power is that power to frame how you understand the world, how you understand what's possible in the world, and to really, in the end of the day, to make you think that something is in your interests even when it's blatantly not in your interests. That's the fundamental power of framing in the media, and the role that the media plays. And I think Harry took us through a story of how the media framed our understanding of the property crisis and the relationship between the media and property, and the degree to which the old-fashioned idea of professionalism as a code of ethics or principles or values has been squeezed by an increasing business practice, and how difficult that is to run against the tide when the whole system is pushing towards a market orientation, when the readers are seen not as citizens anymore but as clients or consumers, and when journalists themselves in their terms and conditions of employment are pushing them towards a form of journalism, you called it, and the kind of flak that they take for trying to expose the kind of framing that is going on in the world and what that means. And he argued that what's really important is that we understand that congruence of interest, because it happens quite subtly in some ways. It happens through very nuanced processes, and sometimes we can be blind to it because it's not always about conflict of interest. It's more subtle than that sometimes, and we need to be constantly aware to it and vigilant to it. And I suppose in terms of where Julian was talking about that need to draw out the understanding that it's not conspiracy theory, that this is the explicit function of what the media do, and he drew attention to who are the role of the experts, who's asked to make those comments, and Kenny being the major expert on Greece was a case in point, but also the potential of some of the core readers to act as feedback and to influence from behind what's happening. His study shows really clearly, I think, the degree to which the reporting is so dominated by the one dominant frame, which was pro-fiscal consolidation. And I think one of the most important things that he pointed to in terms of the absence of maybe the critical analysis in the Irish press, but also the absence of alternatives being promoted, even by those who thought they were promoting alternatives. And that to me is very telling, that when you look at the centre-left commentators, and I think you're talking about organisations like you mentioned, Social Justice Ireland, but I would see myself as fallen into this trap, is that the debate has been so successfully framed by the elite, working in congruence with an elite media, that the terms of the debate are so narrow that sometimes the only way you can get into the debate is actually to lose your point of view from the very start. So you end up debating about the fairest way to implement an austerity agenda, when actually what you meant to do in the debate was to oppose an austerity agenda, but you enter the frame under the conditions in which the media have framed the macro barriers of it. And it's very, very hard to actually engage in media. So what a lot of people do is they don't. They back off, they refuse to fall into the trap, but then you get a total silence of what the alternatives might be. So it's a very, very difficult space. That framing is so strong and so perfectly formed sometimes that it's very, very difficult to go into it. I think the idea of the balcony, with the Berkeley balcony collapse and the 500 suicides is very telling. I think that more generally, I mean, I get your argument about the politics of austerity being the major reason, but what struck me just was comparing, I've never had a chance to go back to do it, but I will someday, just the word count that got relative to the word count perhaps of 8 young men killed in a car crash in Donegal or in Kerry, which I distinctly remember happening and which were 1 or 2 day wonders in our press. So I do think that the class analysis of it is quite an important one as well, in terms of what was going on with it. But a lot of good examples there in relation to the framing of Syriza and Podemos as well. And just returning to those frames, just in terms of my own experience and where I would have been entering some of the media debates, is the complete framing of crisis from a gender perspective, where the total invisibility of any concept that the crisis could be gendered in any way, or that the impact of the crisis could be gendered in any way. And I remember early in the crisis, you mentioned, well, I don't know whether you did or I did, but somebody mentioned Fintan O'Toole. And he was one of the first ones off the blocks with the publication about the crisis, The Ship of Fools. And I did a blog on it and called it The Ship of Men, because I was pointing out that really, you know, if you look in any serious way about what went on in relation to the key actors in the banking crisis, they all had one thing in common, and nobody was talking about it. And it wasn't just that they worked in banks or politics or whatever. And I just thought it was interesting, because from there you could see a public discourse emerging that was very male in its nature, but that was also very male in who was producing it. So I don't know if any of you remember, and again, this was around 2010, I'm on a rant now, 4 Angry Men. Anybody remember that moment?
The tour.
This shocked me to my core. The 4 Angry Men were Fintan O'Toole, Shane Ross, Pat Leahy and Matt Cooper, who had all written fine books. And I was very glad they'd written their books. They were necessary books. They added a lot to our early understanding of the crisis from a critical framework. But the men did not seem to notice how gendered their whole presentation of self and their whole presentation of the analysis of the crisis was. And from there I started keeping a bit of an analysis, much like Julian was doing with the editorials in terms of trying to look at the framing of them. I was more then trying to look at who was critical about some of the framing of the crisis, who were they and what way were they framing the crisis. And I started doing an account of critical blogs like Politico.ie, Politics Reform, ProgressiveEconomy.ie, those kind of places that we were going to find alternative takes on the crisis. And I was finding, as you probably might expect, that 90% of them were male generated in terms of the content of the blogs, which is, you know, quite striking. I was looking at things like letters to the paper. There was a period when maybe one of the only ways to try and get into the political discourse was that 100 people would sign a letter and then we try and get the letter. Remember, there was a time when people were doing that a lot. And even the signatories of letters and academics or public activists, again, very heavily gendered in what was going on. So there's something about that space that's kind of just interesting to unpack and reflect on a little bit more in terms of the creation of even the alternative public sphere is not as alternative as it might look, or as critical from certain perspectives. And just because both of you had the opportunity to make the comments to the banking inquiry, I just published a little while ago in the Irish Political Studies a gendered analysis of the crisis. And part of it I gave over to looking at a gendered analysis of the banking crisis itself, and in some respects a gendered analysis of the banking inquiry. And we know, for example, and we've seen, you know, one woman member of it, and going backwards, we know, you know, one woman on the central bank, no women in the room on the night of September 28, 2008, etc., etc. It's very easy to do a gendered analysis of it and show the absence of women in any of the core moments of the banking inquiry. But one of the interesting things is our absolute failure to analyse that and therefore to draw any lessons from it. So even at an academic level elsewhere, in other countries, at a European Union level, most countries are beginning to examine corporate governance structures and look at what reinforces the high level of groupthink and herd mentality that led to some of the construction of some of the decisions in the banking crisis. The European Union in 2010 brought out a capital directive looking at the reconstruction of the governance of banking and brought forward an implementation of a gender quota on banking boards. In 2013, the Irish Institute of Directors lobbied against the implementation of gender targets on the banks of Irish boards, as did all the banks who were under the terms of the bank guarantee. So quite incredible inability to look, to ask questions, to learn lessons and to implement any lessons from it. Naked in its exposure, in my opinion. The other thing I just wanted to draw attention to maybe is this the framing of the left, and Julian drew attention to examples of how Irish left has been framed. I suppose one of the interesting things from a critical perspective about the Irish left up to maybe the event of Irish Water has been maybe the lack of success in the Irish left of being able to work together in any coherent framing of what could be an alternative that could lead to a fairly significant type of mobilisation. And if you look to lessons from elsewhere, we had Eduardo Silva over, who's written a really interesting book on the emergence of left responses to crisis in Latin America. And he looks at 4 countries in Latin America and how they managed to evolve a left politics out of the context of crisis and the lessons that might be learned from it. But one of the key lessons was the ability to frame things that enabled people to work together. The ability to frame things by political activists of the left in a way that didn't simply articulate what they were against, which is being against austerity, but being able to articulate a vision of what you were for that enabled people to work together in a more hopeful way. And I suppose that the comments about the Jeremy Corbyn are noted there in terms of the what works to actually create new politics. And I do think the Irish Water, the framing of something as right to water certainly gave people a different take and brought out new language. And that movement now of a right to choices and leading into a right to choices about policies and alternatives is interesting, and to me gives me hope that maybe we have learned some lessons about framing and the Irish left, but that would be interesting to throw out as well. The last thing I wanted to draw out was Harry's reference to property porn and just other types of porn that can emerge in the media. And one thing that's coming out of British analysis quite a lot is this idea of what they're calling poverty porn. And I think we haven't had a lot of poverty porn in Ireland yet, but it's a space I would watch for in the context of what might happen as issues emerge in relation to social policy.